As Gretchen mentioned, as you log on to this call, please remember to mute yourself so we avoid that sort of weird feedback we get when people don't have their microphones on mute, especially if you are calling into this on a phone. Please make sure your phone is on mute. We'll go ahead and get started in just about a minute here as people continue to log on to this call. Thanks, everyone. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to Monday. We'll go ahead and get started. First, I hope all of you are doing well out there. This has been an intense period of American history. Not only do we absolutely still have a global pandemic going on, but the eruption of protests we have seen across this nation as a direct consequence of what happened here in Minneapolis has truly shown that we are living in a time that historians will be writing about for quite some time after this. So again, I hope all of you are doing well out there. It feels like a month since we last talked, but it's only been a week and a lot has happened in this past week. The first thing I want to pass along to you is on Wednesday of last week, the executive committee voted unanimously to release a statement joining the AFL-CIO and other labor groups in calling for change within the Minneapolis police union. Even though we did not name Lieutenant Bob Kroll specifically, we joined the calls of other unions asking for that. So that statement, again, was released excuse me, on Wednesday. We did release it on social media and other spaces. I think I posted a copy or a link to it in Basecamp. And again, if you haven't seen that, that's where you can find all of that stuff there. We had, and we still continue to receive questions regarding the Minneapolis Police Union and our relationship to them and other unions' relationships to them, just to kind of give you some insight into why this is a tricky thing, and yet still unions are speaking up about this. Like most police unions, the Federation of Minneapolis Police, or whatever their name is, the Minneapolis Police Union, is completely unaffiliated with other labor groups. So I know early on we had some suggestions and some calls from members saying that we should do something through the AFL-CIO in regard to Minneapolis, but just understand that the Police Union of Minneapolis is not affiliated with the AFL-CIO. They are not affiliated with the Change to Win Federation, which is the other large labor federation, nor are they affiliated with any other state or other local group. They are completely independent, which means they essentially answer to no one but their own membership. And that was kind of the tricky dynamic that we had to deal with in regard to how do we as a labor group respond to that. What we ended up doing is, one, calling out what we think is unacceptable behavior on behalf of that organization. but also to remind them that, like all unions, they are a democratic union, and the membership of that union does have control. And if they so desire to go in a different direction, that is a direction they can go in. So that was kind of the gist and the basis of our statement that we released on Wednesday. And again, we did post it on Facebook, Twitter. We also posted it on our webpage, and that link, if you haven't seen it yet, is in Basecamp. You can go ahead and find that link there. This has been a really challenging time for everyone, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges we have had as a labor organization is thinking through how do we respond, what is our appropriate response, what is our lane here, if you want to use that sort of vocabulary. And if you'll indulge me, I just want to briefly kind of touch on my thinking and our thinking in regard to how we fit into all of this stuff here, and what is our role as a labor organization. And a couple things to consider. One is kind of a national thing. Ever since that phrase was written down, all men are created equal, this country has struggled to live up to that phrase. You know, in many regards, even when we first wrote that statement, all men are created equal, it wasn't all men. It was only men of a certain kind, only men of a certain type, only men of a certain station. That changed, but even when it truly was all men, it didn't mean women. Women were excluded at that point. And even when women were brought into that big tent, it wasn't all women. Women of color were excluded. So we have always had this idea that all people are created equal, and yet we have struggled to live up to that as a country. That has always been the promise and the vision that we have been chasing after. In the labor movement, there's something similar. And when it was with the Knights of Labor, it was this phrase, an injury to one is the concern of all. When the industrial workers of the world started to do what they did in the early parts of the 20th century, that phrase morphed into an injury to one is an injury to all. And this really kind of fell into that same tradition that we have been chasing as a country, that all men are created equal. And that is that when one person is suffering, when one person is experiencing tyranny, when one person is experiencing repression, or one person is experiencing repression, we are all experiencing that. And that really was the sort of basis for a sort of labor movement as we understand it today. Both the IWW and later the Committee and then Congress of Industrial Organizations really held this idea that if we are truly working people looking out for each other, an injury to anyone is a concern or an injury to the rest of us. However, we have always kind of been chasing that ideal as well, because as soon as that phrase was uttered, people tried to kind of limit that to say, well, is it really an injury to anyone? Maybe it's just an injury to a member. Maybe it's just an injury to a member in good standing. Maybe it's just an injury to a member who's in good standing, who's of the correct color, right? And so as a labor movement, we've always had this vision, this idea of where we want to be, but have never really tried, or have always been chasing that ideal to become more perfect in regard to that phrase, an injury to one is an injury to all. And so as a labor organization in this country, as we kind of look toward what's happening, what's going on around this country, it is absolutely part of our fabric, part of who we are as an organization, to be a part of this, to be a part of these calls for greater justice, to be a part of this call for ending racism, for talking about the structures that perpetuate these sorts of things. And so it absolutely is part of our lane. If you want to get a little bit more specific, though, about what this means to us as a higher education union, though, consider this. The move to privatize education was actually, in many ways, an outgrowth of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in the 1950s. And so when the Brown ruling came out, this idea that all public schools had to be funded equally, of course, in the South, that presented a problem, because you had unequal funding for schools for students of color, and you had more funding for white schools, basically. And so the idea was, how do you deal with this federal ruling that doesn't upset the federal ruling, but allows you to continue on that particular way of life that they had in the South? And the answer to that was privatization, right? This idea that, well, if you had private schools and you can funnel money to them, and those schools could be better funded than the public schools, and those schools could also be exclusionary, right? Whether or not on the basis of color, could be on the basis of wealth, could be on any sort of those sorts of things. And so this idea that privatization was a way to continue on the sort of Jim Crow ideals in the South really was the sort of basis for this privatization movement. Higher education, of course, has experienced privatization in a measure that has gone far beyond what you see in E12 or K-12 schools. To this point today, and Mark, I know you probably have committed to memory. He's looking at me like, oh, God, I didn't know you were going to ask something. What the divestment in public education in Minnesota has meant. And the numbers are truly atrocious, of course. as the state has divested from education. Again, part of this long legacy of divesting from public institutions, which also includes healthcare, of course. As those things have happened, we have moved to funding more and more of what we do through tuition. And because we are an open access institution, a lot of our students who we're asking to foot the bill for what's going on here, because it's been declined in public investment, they live in more increasingly precarious situations. And so you get a situation like you have right now, where this divestment from public education, which again has some really long roots here in American history, going all the way back to the Jim Crow South, has led to a situation where the foundation for what we do is precarious, because it's built on precarious things. It's built on precarious populations. It's built on our students who simply can't afford to continue on schooling if they were to lose a job or two, because they have nowhere else to get that money to pay for the education, because the state's not paying for it. And so if we want to talk about why all this has a direct relationship to us, it's not just because we are moving in the spirit of the labor movement, we're moving in that spirit of a better vision of this country as a whole, but it's also something in which we have seen the end result of these sorts of things that seek to divide us, and has made us as faculty, has made our institutions less stable, has made us more precarious. And even to the point in which, as we think about the COVID-19 and the global pandemic, which I want to remind everyone is still going on out there, part of the reason why there are so many schools, institutions, and colleges and universities who are going to try to do some sort of face-to-face instruction, it is because they have become so dependent on revenue via tuition that they will not be able to survive unless they can do that. And so you see how this has come full circle to us in the end here, right? The issues of race and racism in this country have not just prevented us from living up to our own espoused ideals, it has also made a more precarious and less solid footing for all of us as we move into this fall. So again, this is absolutely our lane, and we'll continue to move in this lane as best we can and find our way forward here. I just want to talk about a couple things that we're seeing coming out this past week as conversations on George Floyd and others have moved ahead. And I just want to say, from my thinking, a lot of these things are pieces of the puzzle, but they're not the whole picture, but they're important parts of it, right? Some of the conversations we've heard have to do with curriculum and what goes on in the classroom, what happens with law enforcement training. I know there are conversations that are moving very quickly about that. Those conversations had already been happening within the system office prior to George Floyd, but those will continue on, I'm sure. But also what happens in our general education program, what happens in our transfer curriculum, how do those things become an important piece of the puzzle as we all move forward here. We also know that there are conversations happening in the broader sphere in regard to arbitration and labor contracts. We have seen many conversations open up about why Minneapolis allowed certain police officers to stay on the force, and some people think that arbitration has something to do with that, and that I think is a part of the conversation. It's not the whole thing, but it's definitely a part of that conversation. And so those conversations are continuing on, and they will continue to go forward, I'm sure, as with many other conversations. As those things develop, we will absolutely keep you in the loop. But what I do want to suggest to all of you today here in this call, because again, we open this up to all leadership throughout the system. I think as we talk about these things, one, we want to keep sure in our minds that we remember that these are important pieces of the puzzle, but they're not everything. Having just one more training session during a school year is not going to fix the problem, right? It's an important part of it, but that alone is not going to solve everything. Having a tough conversation about arbitration within police unions is not going to fix the problem. It's a part of it, but it's not going to fix the whole thing. We have to have the conversation. We'll have to be thinking about how this stuff moves forward, but that on itself is not going to end everything that we're seeing going on here. And so as leaders in this organization, I think we're going to also have some tough conversations about how we respond to these sorts of things in a way in which we endeavor to be part of the solution and not just shut down these conversations. And so thinking about, for instance, curriculum, one of our most cherished things that we do as faculty, this really is the core of our entire work. In the past, I think, we have always approached curriculum as a sort of hands-off, you can't tell us what to do sort of thing. And I think this is where we're going to have to be thoughtful and be thinking about how we shift that conversation to say things like, well, racism is bad, but we have academic freedom. You can't make us do anything about it. We're going to have to flip that conversation and find a way to talk about this differently, to which we say, racism is bad, and because we have academic freedom, we have the power to do something about it. And so those are ways we're going to have to change the way we have these conversations. Or we talk about compensation for the work that we do. Lots of times we have said, well, You know, we don't work for free, so you can't make me do that work, right? I think when it comes to these sorts of issues, we're going to have to change how we have those conversations to say, well, we can't work for free, so we need to figure out how we can advocate to get the resources to make sure this important work gets done. Again, we're going to have to find ways to change the ways we talk about what we do so that we don't lose the important things that we have, but also that we don't allow those things to become barriers to changing the world that we see around us. Because again, this has a direct material effect on all of us, and it's absolutely something that we need to endeavor as a labor organization to somehow participate in making a better world out of all of this stuff. So we will continue on having those conversations. Gretchen, are you still on the call? I know we have some meetings coming up. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about that right now.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. We do. I've been working with the Racial Equity and Diversity Committee, and on the Min-State call last Wednesday that was organized and presented by the Indigenous Men and Men of Color Working Group and put out through Min-State. Hopefully some of you were able to get on that call or get into that session. I know that it maxed out at 500 and then they increased the limit and it maxed out at 1,000. So, and I'm still watching for a recording of that. But during that presentation, they put out a platform of changes that they are calling for within the Min-State system. And so the Racial Equity and Diversity Committee is going to use that platform kind of as a starting point for a conversation with our members about, you know, exactly the things that Matt was just talking about, right? How do we as faculty and how do we as a labor union support the changes that we know need to be made in our system? So we've scheduled 3 listening sessions, discussion sessions, and you should be getting an email later on today that's going to be coming out, and we'll include the links to register for those sessions in the summary for today as well. We've got one scheduled for tomorrow at 5 o'clock. We have another one scheduled Wednesday at 1, and we have a third one scheduled Thursday at 3. We're limiting the number of participants to each for each session to 30. So you do need to pre-register. So when you get that email, pre-register, and if we get more people interested and wanting to participate, then we have openings. We will schedule additional meetings. But really just want to start the conversation with our members about where we go from here, kind of using that platform that was put out by the Indigenous Men and Men of Color Working Group last week as a starting point. That's what I got.
All right, thanks, Gretchen. And again, as Gretchen just said, when we send out the recap update, we'll include those links in there for you as well, so you can kind of watch out for those sorts of things. And again, I am so inspired and honored to be a part of these conversations, to be a part of the labor movement, and specifically this organization, the Minnesota State College faculty at this time. You know, my inbox has been flooded and lit up with people not just saying thank you for taking a stand, thank you for saying something, but also saying I want to do more. How can I do more? How can I get plugged in? Where can I go from here? This matters to me. It matters to us. And I want to be a part of moving this country forward and moving this country away from these dark times we're in right now. And I think that is an important thing. And I just, you know, I know I had shared this with some people, but I just want to broadcast this a little more widely. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this, where labor fits into this moment in history, not just in regard to race relations, but this country as an entire whole. You know, seeing how the military was deployed against protesters across this country, seeing what happened in Washington, D.C. You know, I think it is worth all of us remembering that there is that poem that was written during the Second World War that talked about, you know, then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. A couple of lines earlier in that poem, it talks about the trade unionists, right? Talking about how the trade unions, labor unions in particular, were a powerful bulwark against fascism and these sorts of things. And that's because our voices united, our strength united, have power, have the ability to make better change in this world, have the ability to advocate not just for political freedom, but economic freedom, to make sure that everyone has a life of dignity and respect. And that's what makes us powerful. That's also why groups don't like us. All the groups that have aligned against us over the years, this is precisely the power that they fear. So again, I'm so honored to be in this with all of you as we go forward here. The other update we have to pass along to you has to do with safety. We have continued to have conversations with the system office, with labor relations, and other labor groups inside of Minnesota State regarding safety and safety plans. Thank you for those of us who have passed along those safety plans on your campus. The system office initially said they were going to collate those plans and give them all to us. And they said, oh, we don't know how to do that. We can't figure that out. So we know they're happening on the campus. Again, as we mentioned in this call last week, chapter presidents, grievance reps, or any MSCF representatives on the chapter level, you should be asking your campus administration for those plans. They should be giving you those plans. And then if you would mind forwarding those on to us so we can kind of continue to collect those safety plans. Again, we've seen a lot of problematic areas in some of those plans that have been forwarded to us, specifically in regard to who's responsible for equipment, who's responsible for enforcement, what the chain of command is. And some of the plans that we have seen, those things are not clear, and those are really problematic areas for us. We've also seen at least one what is known as a Clery notification from the Clery Act. This is safety on campuses. And so apparently when a student or there is an infection on a campus, that will trigger a Clery notification to all people on that campus. If you get one of those Clery notifications on your campus, don't assume that we get a copy of that. Please forward that on to us as well. Again, those are other things that we want to keep track of as this kind of goes forward here. I think we all understand that this pandemic has not slowed down. It's summer, it's nice outside, people are going back outside, so it feels like the threat is diminished a little bit, but I think we also all, understand at least rationally that this pandemic is not done, and I think we're all expecting an uptick as we go forward into the fall. We're not quite sure what exactly that's going to mean. I think maybe some of you saw the news, and I'll share it with you. Marnie Zhang, who was a member of the St. Paul School Board, who was only 31 years old, passed away a couple of days ago as a result of COVID-19. Again, only 31 years old. And so again, we know that this pandemic is real. It is serious. This is truly a life and death thing. And so that's why safety is such a big, important issue for us to all kind of be keeping an eye on. So with that, I'll hand it over to Gretchen and see if we have anything going on in the chat area.
Hi, Matt. I've got one question, and then another one just popped up. But the first one actually I think is a really good one. And that is, are any colleges working on measurable COVID-related goals such as zero on-campus transmission?
That's a great question and a great idea. And I have not heard of anything like benchmarks. I haven't heard of anything quite like that yet. But I think that's again, I have a call with some other labor groups this afternoon to talk about Minnesota State MSCF specifically and in regard to their plans. That's a question that I will definitely kind of bring along to that one, because I think that's we should be thinking about those sorts of things. How do we know when it's safe? How do we know when it's not safe? And I think those are all great parts of the conversation. I haven't seen anything from the system that relates to benchmarks like those, but I think that's something we'll definitely push into that conversation. So thank you for that.
And then the next one is really more of a comment. St. Paul College had a chapter conversation last Friday, and there was a desire to earmark some of our rolled over unused professional development funds from the 1920 year for chapter trainings, workshops, etc. in the anti-racism space.
I'm guessing that's 2020. Yeah, I think that's great. And again, what we have seen, I know that as we talked about in the call last week, the way I envision the state office fitting into this is we can coordinate and manage logistics and pass along information, especially in ways in which we can do that at the state office in a way that can't happen at the chapter level. But chapters absolutely have a role, a very important, if not maybe a more critical role to play in some of these conversations, because that's really where the rubber hits the pavement. So I think that's a fantastic thing that's happening out of St. Paul College.
Can I just follow up on that, Matt, too, and say, I think I've talked with a couple of chapters about this. Education Minnesota has some really great trainings, including an 8-hour cultural competency training. So if anybody is interested in scheduling one of those for your chapters or a couple of chapters, please reach out to me or your field staff and we can absolutely get those scheduled.
Go ahead.
Okay, so now we have a question about deans asking faculty to report how much time they may have spent recently on campus. Say preparing teaching kits for students. Is this innocuous or problematic in some way? The dean's actual words, we just need to track how often people are coming to campus to report to the system office.
We have heard at least a couple different things on that. I'm not sure what this particular iteration of that. We do know that during the spring 2020 semester, especially as we moved into April, the system was trying to track how much time was spent directly related to the COVID-19 response. And that was primarily so they would have some sort of data trail if they were to request further mitigation funds from either the state or the federal government, that they'd be able to say, this is why we need this much money. So again, that was really tracking data so they could get money to recoup some of the losses that they experienced due to the COVID-19 stuff. I also believe it's quite possible that people would be tracking movement on campus just to kind of from safety and health perspective. I think anytime a dean or a supervisor comes to you to ask that sort of information, it's always just a fair question to say, what is this information needed for? Just so you know what's going on. Again, the concern we had when they were tracking time in the spring semester was there didn't seem to actually be any clear answer as to why they're doing it. When they finally told us, well, so we can try to get more money, we said, well, great, that's fantastic. Why didn't you just start that conversation saying, we're trying to get more money, help us track the time, right? So again, those directives sometimes, unfortunately, lose the context in which they come out of. So that's always, I think, a good question to ask at the beginning, which is why and what's going on here. What we've seen so far has mostly been innocuous and quite beneficial in some instances. So I think with that particular request, that would be the question to ask there. Where is this coming from? What's it going to be used for? And then move forward once you know the answers to that.
Okay, and Will is looking for a reaction to the University of Minnesota president's proposal to meet face-to-face in the fall.
Yeah, that is it's just a proposal. And I know what was reported in the Star Tribune was a really sort of condensed, watered down version of what was close to an 80-page document that was will be presented to the University of Minnesota Regents Thursday and Friday. What that document gets into is they want to return to face-to-face if these other conditions play into it. So again, I think what was reported in the Star Tribune and other places is maybe getting a little bit over the skis and that sort of stuff. There's a lot of questions that have yet to be answered there. It's not a sure shot on what that's going to look like. But I can tell you a lot of systems, and this has been the sort of chatter around, registrars, CAOs, college and university presidents. If they're unable to do face-to-face, a whole bunch of other stuff falls apart. For example, one of the things that I saw, this was reported in the Strib this morning, if they can't do face-to-face this fall, the entire sports program starts to implode. And of course, on a Division I campus like the University of Minnesota, that's not a small thing. And so I think you see all these pressures coming together to try to force something to happen. I think what will be interesting to watch here is to see how that sort of move on behalf of the University of Minnesota will change the conversations coming out of the system office. That remains to be seen. But again, we are keeping an eye on what's happening with the U because oftentimes what they do sets the standard for what other campuses and institutions and systems will do here in Minnesota. And so we'll definitely be watching that Regents meeting on Thursday and Friday.
Okay. Marin has shared a link to another training that was developed by one of the philosophy faculty at MCTC. So we'll include that in the summary as well, or find some place to collect these and share them out. And then Arlene made the comment that they have forms to fill out to enter the buildings. At South Central, they say they need to report to the system office and re-sanitize the areas we entered.
That's interesting. Our understanding is that the system office really is hands-off on what's happening on the campus. So I just find it interesting that they would say, well, we're going to report this to the system office. Again, I think one of the more pointed criticisms we have shared with the system office is a sort of Wild West situation they have created out there with every campus coming up with their own safety plan. And that again, has been really problematic for us.
All right, Matt, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat at the moment.
Well, it is exactly 12:45. So again, it's a warm Monday out there. It is a Monday. I don't know how your summer is going, but these days all seem to blend together, and I'm not even sure what year it is half the time anymore. So with that, we will be back on this call, I believe, next week at 12:15 on Monday. Again, because we're moved on to the Zoom platform, I know there's transition in leadership that always happens over the summer. So feel free to share this link with others from your campus leadership team, whoever can be here. We're happy to have them. This is not restricted to just chapter presidents and grievance reps. So whoever can be here to kind of get the updates and pass along questions, we're happy for that. But we will be back a week from today, 12:15 on this call. I hope your summers are going well. I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you're all doing well and taking care of each other out there. And we will see all of you in a week. Take care.